So yes, welcome to what's notoriously known as the graveyard shift for conferences after lunch. So I know you've all got nice full tummies, but people tend to get a little bit drowsy, so I have to work extra hard so you don't nod off. Now that's a challenge because I'm not really a song and dance kind of speaker, and I don't pound the pulpit or raise my voice or anything very often. Except I've now been teaching this year, I do a little bit more raising my voice, just to get attention. But yeah, can I just remind you that the name of the conference is the Awake Conference, okay? So please don't forget that, the Awake Conference. So let's stay awake. That would be awfully ironic if you weren't, right? But yes, I'm not the kind who'll do all those crazy things, but what we will do to keep you awake is to look at a relatively quick overview of the book of Esther. You might not think it's quick, but we'll do as quickly as we can, but without losing what we want to see here, because there's fascinating stuff in here. Now, some of you may think, hang on, this is a prophecy conference. What's Esther got to do with prophecy? But I hope you can see by the end of our session why I get excited about the prophetic aspects of this book. Now, if those of you who were with us at the Bustleton conference earlier this year, you might remember I brought out some of the prophetic patterns in the early chapters of Joshua. If you weren't there, you can still look it up on the Gather and Gain website. So my plan today is to go something along those kind of lines again. And no, I'm not going to unhitch the Old Testament. It's indispensable. As some have said regarding the two testaments of the Bible, the Old is concealed in the New. In fact, Chuck Missler says this as well. And the New is concealed in the Old, and the Old is revealed in the New. So we need them both, and we need to use them both together. So yep, I'm in the Old Testament again, this time to trace the story of Esther, but again, finding greater truth in the typology of this amazing piece of God's Word. Now, for those who aren't sure, typology is the study of types or symbols. So it's really the study of the patterns in smaller events, and in this case, real life events that actually happened, and how those patterns give us information about greater realities. In this case, God's plan for a time future to the events themselves. So when Esther happened, because as has been well said by some, prophecy is pattern. It's not just giving a prediction and then it's fulfilled. That's a subset of the greater idea of what prophecy really is. And as a simple example we should all be familiar with, Jesus explained a type for us in John 3:14 when he said this: as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, that's the type, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. It's called the antitype, or the greater reality that the type foreshadowed or pointed to. And this can happen because God is in control of all events, and he sometimes guides them and he shapes them to communicate to us if we're willing to pay attention. And God's ultimate sovereignty over events is all the more intriguing in the book of Esther because it's a book famous in the Bible for being one that never actually mentions God at all. So he's hinted at in subtle ways, but no actual reference to Yahweh, God, appears anywhere in the narrative, not on the surface anyway. So I find it even more exciting that in reality, God and his plan are deeply foundational to everything that happens here, and by the end, hopefully you'll see that. And his quiet hand can be easily seen working in all the events and interactions, which I find incredibly exciting. Because it's actually like life today. In a world which is trying to shove God out and Jesus more and more out of the way, the truth is that he's absolutely in the thick of all, just as much as he ever has been. And that's why I love talking about typology, because it shows not only God's power, the fact that he can cause events to happen in a certain way, but it also shows his care for us, and it shows his genius and his incredible love. So what's not to like about that? There's so many good things about God that come through. So I hope you encounter some of those things today, and not just by my talk, but in those who have already been, and Kevin who's coming after me. So yes, typology is cool. And typology is also referred to as shadows. Hence the name of this presentation, as I said before, in the shadows of Esther. So you can see the idea is that God's working in the background here. And I love the description of things as shadows, these types, because that image captures some key things. So let me show you what I mean. Now I'm going to show you a shadow on the screen in a second, and I want you to tell me what real object has made this shadow. It's not a hard test. What's that object? It's a bike, right? Very simple. So you know it's a bicycle because you can see the shape of the shadow, right? It tells you information about the thing that made it. It's not the object itself, okay? That's the key. It's not the object itself. The shadow is the shape of the real thing, but it's not the real thing. A shadow tells us a lot about the form and the character of the real thing, but ultimately it's only a pointer to the object that made it. If you follow that shadow back, you'll find the object, won't you? Because it starts there. In the same way, the book of Esther points to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the kingdom of God. And it does this through its context in the pagan kingdom of man, or a pagan kingdom of man, specifically the Persian kingdom, around 480 BC-ish, in the region today called Iran, which is very anti the gospel at this point. So there are heaps of shadows in the gospel almost everywhere you look in the book of Esther, or shadows of the gospel, sorry, in the book of Esther, and it leads us to a fascinating overview of the millennial kingdom as well, so that's all ahead of us. But first, we'll just have a little taster with a comparison of types, okay, comparison of the of some types we find in the book of Esther. So we're going to look at two passages in the book of Esther in parallel. And literally I'll have them parallel on the screen. If the writing's too small, I recommend maybe have your finger in there. Now I'm going to assume some prior knowledge of the story in this, and looking at my audience, I believe most of you know Esther pretty well. But for now, hopefully this will make sense to you if it's a little bit hazy still. So the first section is from chapter 3, verse 15 to 4, verse 3. And this is the bit when the decree to kill all the Jews has just been decided, and the word has to get out. And notice as we read it, there's a bit of news about there's a bit about the news hurrying out. So just the three sections here, and then there's a bit about Mordecai, and then there's a bit about the response of people, especially the Jews. Okay, so that's kind of the chunks of this section. So let's have a look at it. Verse 15. Where the bad news goes out. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, or Shushan. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Okay, that's the first section. Then there's Mordecai's response. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his robes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And then after that, finally, we get the broader response from God's elect people, the Jews, verse 3. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting. And many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. So it's all looking pretty bleak at this point. But to cut a long story short for now, a bunch of amazing coincidences, or we can call them God incidences, they happen that lead to this edict being superseded in favour of the Jews. And interestingly, we see this proclamation and its effects described in many nearly identical terms and phrases over another 4-verse section. So if you jump over to chapter 8 now, you'll see this pattern re-emerge, verses 14 to 17. So I think by using this literary technique, clearly the author of Esther wants us to connect these passages together for some reason. So why would he want that? So as we go on now, I'll underline the similar bits in case you missed them. So let's see, verse 14, the news goes out again, but this time it's good news, okay? So it's the other side of the coin. And you'll see today there's so much about the other side of the coin in Esther. Verse 14, so the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. So you see that language is very similar. The next part, we see Mordecai again, only this time dressed a little differently to last time. Verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. What was he dressed in last time? sackcloth and ashes. So there's a big difference there. Let's look at that comparison. Then lastly, the response of the Jews, but also the Gentiles a bit. And we'll get to why they're included this time in a minute, but end of verse 15 onwards. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honour. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. It's a bit different, isn't it? And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? But so what? Well, remember, prophecy is pattern. So how about this? We all need to know the news that there's an eternal death sentence pronounced on everyone due to sin. Yes, we need to know that, don't we? It's not bad news, but it's necessary and urgent news. Well, it is bad news in a sense, but we need to know it, really. So what's the right response to such news? Well, like Mordecai, we should weep over our sin. It's filth being represented by the sackcloth and ashes that he wore. Because, also like him, it keeps us from having access to the king. Do you see that? He didn't have access to the king, but he had to stay at the gate. We're not allowed to enter. And the response is the same for all genuine people of God. An attitude of repentance for sin is necessary to be able to receive the deliverance on offer, as long as a certain someone intercedes. And so when they do, and the edict of deliverance is issued, the news is even more urgent, right? So it began in the city, so we're looking at the other half now. It began in the city, but was rapidly taken everywhere in the kingdom. So now the figurehead of the people, so here Mordecai, is dressed in royal clothes. And notice where he's coming from. Can you see where he's coming from? Coming from the presence of the king. So he went out from the presence of the king. So now he has access to the king. And this is replicated right across the people of God, and they all celebrate. In fact, those who aren't part of the people of God join them, and they become part of them, and they celebrate with them. Now, I'm going to leave some of those ideas hanging a bit. There's a few threads there. But I hope you can see those gospel patterns and types are woven deeply into all this. But like I said, this is just a taster. So that's kind of in a nutshell. We really need to look at the book as a whole if we're going to see it all more sharply. So let's step through the story of Esther now. So there are several key characters in the drama, but the whole book really centres around the fortunes of two people, Esther, obviously, and an angry man of Amalekite descent called Haman. And the time we pick up the story, which was probably about 483 BC, about 30 years or so before the days of Nehemiah. And they lived in the kingdom of Persia under King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes. So that's the Greek version of his name. Ahasuerus is the Hebrew version. And I did debate in myself whether I should go with the more commonly known name Xerxes or the more scholarly Ahasuerus. But I've decided to go with Xerxes. I hope that's right with everyone. It's just most people are more familiar. I know my wife Steph says, I wish you would just say Xerxes. It's easier than Ahasuerus. So okay, we'll go with Xerxes. But ultimately the story really does revolve around this intriguing juxtaposition of the lives of Esther and Haman. Okay? So let's get to know Esther first. So most of us know she was actually born as Hadassah, but Esther was her Persian name. I'm not getting into name meaning, that's a whole other thing. There's so much more there, but I'm leaving that out today. But she became an orphan in her childhood and was adopted by her dad's nephew, whose name was Mordecai, who was presumably much older than her. So that's how the generations worked in their family. So at this point in her life, she was obviously dependent on Mordecai for everything. So she was a good, obedient daughter to him, as we see in a couple of places in the story, and one is in 2 verse 10, where we read this. So Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So clearly Esther did what Mordecai asked. And again we read in same chapter verse 20, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. I think God includes that piece of information so we can see that she obeyed him now the way she always had. So she's an obedient daughter. Okay, no one's sinless, but she was generally speaking an obedient child. But also see that the particular focus is again on the issue of identity. She kept her true identity veiled to everyone but her closest people. But to fill up the backstory here, the reason she found her way into the king's court was that the queen, Vashti, had been kicked out for disobeying King Xerxes. That's kicking out your wife, so, because that's divorce. That's not desirable, but that's what happened. And mostly we say, hey, good on her, because we know the reason she finally lost favour with Xerxes was that he had commanded her to come and dance before the drunken officials and friends, and he wanted to show her off, basically, because she was attractive. And so she was maybe one of the early feminists there, say no way to that. I'm not doing that. Now, it seems from the nature of the story that perhaps the king was fairly unhappy with her anyway, even before this, and this may have just been the excuse he was looking for. We don't know, but anyway, the point is he banished Vashti and put an ad up on Seek, so looking for a new queen. Was Seek around then? Yeah, probably, on tablets. Let that sink in as a joke, no, that's right. All right, so yeah, Xerxes was looking for a new queen. And the idea was put to him that he should get all the eligible young ladies in the kingdom to basically audition for the role for the new queen. And since she lived in the capital city, Susa, soon enough the beautiful young Esther was entered in the beauty pageant, so to speak. Only it had far more longer lasting effects if you won this one. It's not just a bit of an award and a bit of glory and that was it, no. If you pleased the king the most, you would marry him and you would become royalty. And that's how it turned out for Esther. So as we read in chapter 2, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favour in his sight, more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So Vashti didn't cut it, and neither did all the other most beautiful and eligible women on the land. Only Esther was chosen as queen, though, thereby taking the authority that came with the position. But it had taken her a long time of preparation, all the special beauty treatments and diets and all kinds of things over a long period of time to get her to that point. But ultimately we get the impression that it was her character that won her favour, since at every step of the way those who had charge of her quickly took a liking to her, so you see that in several places. Now, maybe that was something to do with the fact she was particularly attractive as well, but there's definitely a sense that there was more to it than that. And that's really what genuineness and integrity of character tend to do to the average person. They tend to win other people over, right? If you're an authentic person, it draws people in. And I say the average person because it seems that those who have authority these days seem more likely to be won over by those who are not like that. Rather, those who are conniving and treacherous, I seem to like those kind of people. But certainly, good character is very admirable in the vast majority of people. You see it amongst people we hang out with. Okay, so we'll talk about Haman a bit soon, but first we really need to discuss Mordecai. By the way, all these pictures are from the movie One Night with the King, I think. That's from 2006 movie. We watched it as part of our Christian Ed class in school. I showed it for our kids, so just so you know where the pictures come from. But Mordecai was clearly well connected even before all these recorded events happened. But as we've already seen, he must also have been quite generous because he took on his uncle's daughter as his own. And we're not told if he had a wife or not, but if he did, there's no mention of her anywhere in the text. So it's possible that he was acting as a sole parent, but that would be conjecture. But if he was, it did make him even more of an impressive person. At any rate, he clearly loved his adopted daughter Esther, as we see in 2 verse 11, where he would daily walk in front of the royal court to see how she was going. You know, he's always had an interest in her welfare and how she was progressing. So clearly he loved and he was protective of Esther as he would his own daughter. And he was also proud of his Jewish heritage in a good way. And he knew it was expedient for Esther to not disclose her true nationality. So as we saw, he told her not to, but no one was in any doubt that Mordecai was Jewish. There was no hiding that, which is what got him into trouble when we see this guy Haman, so we'll get that in a minute. But first, there's an important point in the plot where Mordecai exposes a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. So when he finds out, he tells Esther, now the queen, and she passes it on to Xerxes. And when Xerxes checks it out and finds that it's true, he executes the conspirators and settles it all down. So Mordecai has saved Xerxes' life, and the event was written down in the annals, but that was it. So no fanfare, nothing else was done, and Mordecai went about his business as usual. And that seems like a small thing, but it's actually a very important key in the plot, so we'll see that soon. Okay, let's get back to this guy called Haman. Let's talk a little bit about him. Haman. Now, Haman comes into the picture all of a sudden in chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. So Haman is identified as an Agagite, meaning he's a descendant of Agag, who was an Amalekite. And the Amalekites were infamous as far as the Jews were concerned, because God decreed in 1 Samuel 15 that they were to be wiped out entirely because of their sin of opposing Israel, especially in regards to the Exodus time. But clearly the animosity lived on, because here we are almost 1,000 years on from Moses, and Haman openly talks about, or he openly hates the Jews, which is something that's very often an indicator that Satan is at work in someone. And we touched on that just recently with Stuart. So Satan has a particular hatred for God's elect people, and so it will show through in those who are allowing him to access their lives in some way. And because of that distorted influence in his heart and mind, in Haman's heart and mind, you can really see his paranoia and his foolishness come through strongly in many aspects of the story. So keep an eye out for that as we go through. So just what Haman's heart and mind are like. But for now, we need to just be aware that he's been elevated to basically second in command over the whole empire. Therefore, he had almost total power. As far as Xerxes would let him anyway, he could pretty much do what he wanted, which was pretty much, like I said, free reign, as you will see. And it all begins to heat up when this good character of Mordecai, seen here in his profound dislike for Haman, perhaps due to his Amalekite heritage or just his plain disgust for his character, or maybe both, I don't know. But when that goodness clashes with Haman's profound hatred of Jews, that's when we see interesting things happen. Because you see, in ancient Persia, when someone of senior rank came past you, you were supposed to bow to him. Like, you salute an officer in the army or whatever as they come past. Now, we're not sure whether that was intended as an indication of worship or just respect, but either way, Mordecai's conscience wouldn't allow him to do that. So he repeatedly refused to bow to Haman, because it wasn't just once, it was a consistent decision of his, I'm not bowing to this guy. Now, for someone as insecure and prideful as Haman, that was a huge insult. And the fact that Mordecai was Jewish was further salt in the wound. So that festering hatred built up until he hatched a plan to get rid of not just Haman, but every single Jew. And as is the way of the devil, if the murderous intent wasn't bad enough, he had to cover it with deception too, which you can pick up if you read his pitch to Xerxes in 3 verse 8. So that's where we're going to go next, 3 verse 8. So maybe look at the deception in here. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them." Who's he talking about? I don't know. It doesn't say. So he presented this as just a little bit of an annoyance, but he kept the identity of these people he wanted to get rid of secret, right? And basically said, "King, you needn't trouble yourself with the details. I'll deal with this." So, hide the detail from the decision maker so they'll just say yes. Have you heard that recently? Right out of the same playbook, I would argue, but I digress. But he succeeds in his proposal to Xerxes, and Xerxes hands his official ring to Haman, which is effectively a blank cheque to do as he pleased, and the decree to annihilate the Jews was given, which was the first one of the 2 comparison passages we saw earlier. So that's the decree where it went out. Now, as part of that, they needed to set a date for it to happen. And so to do that, they cast lots, which was called Pur, and settled on the date of the 13th of Adar after much shenanigans, but they got there, which in the 12th month, 13th of Adar in the 12th month, which was around about March on our calendar. And if I say anything, Kevin wants to correct me, I hope that's right, but I think that's right. The date was exactly 11 months away from when the proclamation came out. Now, that reveals that the date this happened, that they set the date, was the 13th of the first month, Nisan, which is important to note, and we'll definitely come back to that in a while. But the thing to remember is that Haman is having a bit of a win at this point. Everything he seems to be doing now is succeeding, so he's pretty happy, except for one thing. Another thing is a person, except for one person. The highest ranked Jew in the land, or so he thought. Esther was higher, but he didn't know she was Jewish. But the highest known Jew in the land was still refusing to recognise him. And it drove him crazy. Now, okay, back to Esther. She hears the news of the edict of death for her people through Mordecai, and the two of them discuss, so via a messenger called Hatak. Because remember that Mordecai can't get access to the palace because of his sackcloth. So they've got a messenger bounces back and forwards, and they discuss what they can do about it through this messenger. So should Esther try and plead for her people, who the king doesn't know are her people yet? He doesn't realise he's just signed off on his own wife's execution. The problem is that to do that, she would have to approach him unannounced, and even for the queen, that was technically a capital crime, and I'm sure you'll know that part of the story. So she really had to count the cost. She had to think about that and pray it over. And it's worth reading this bit in full, so we'll get the gravity of the situation they find themselves in. So let's pick it up at 4 verse 13. And remember, the courier group led by Hatak is bouncing back and forward between the two, like I said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think of yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Is that famous line. But did you catch that? Even though God is not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the book, he's clearly implied as sovereign here in Mordecai's words. You see that? Yep. Verse 15 and 16. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. So we send them back. "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Now, what does this tell us about Esther? Lots of things, but firstly is that she really had to wrestle with this commission to save her people. You can see in the tone of her words there, it wasn't easy, and she was going to have to lay her life on the line if she was going to do this. In fact, that famous last line there is telling. Basically, she considered herself dead at that point. So my life is worth giving down for this, if that's what it comes to. She was willing to sacrifice herself to save her people. And she also knew that such a thing needed God's help. So she and her friends all fasted, which is one way of consciously submitting yourself to God's will. Now, what day did the pronouncement come again? 13th of Nisan. So it would be logical to assume that all this began on the 14th of Nisan. Now, does anyone know the significance of the 14th of Nisan? Don't say anything, Kevin. Anyone know? Passover? Passover, yep. Now, does anyone else know a famous event in the Bible that happened at Passover? Actually, there's a few. But what's the most momentous? Christ, the crucifixion of Jesus. Yeah. And he spent how long in the grave? 3 days and 3 nights. Interesting. But we'll get back to that later. The point is, Esther self-sacrificially agreed to intercede for her people. And as it turned out, the king did accept her, which is all part of the type. As is the extra verse in this passage. So it doesn't sound like much, but when Esther asked him to organise the fasting team, this is what verse 17 says happened. Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Notice that. Now who's doing the ordering? Esther. So it's interesting that from this point on, it's Mordecai following Esther's orders. So we'll bring all this back around in a while. Remember, Esther grew up obedient. This is different. But getting back to Esther and the king, her actual request was hidden at first. She just wanted to invite Xerxes and Haman to dinner, just those two. And the king agrees to this, and so Haman is invited and they all have dinner that night. Now you might think that Esther will present her request at that meal, right? But instead she invites them both to another meal for the following night. Now Haman's pretty chuffed at this second special invitation, and he brags to his wife and his friends that he's a big shot, like, I got invited to this another dinner with the king and queen. I must be pretty important. But he still gets ticked off at Mordecai's refusal to bow in between all this, which kind of spoils the whole thing for him. So he decides he can't wait for the 13th of Adar to get rid of him. So he builds at his own house what most translations call a gallows, which it was more likely a big wooden stake, I think, from what I've read about this. So it was more the style of the time, or it possibly even could have been like a cross, a crucifixion. And his plan was to skewer Mordecai on it the next day, if he could get the approval of Xerxes, which he got before to kill a whole nation of people. So I guess he figured it wouldn't be too hard this time, just for one person. So it's interesting, isn't it? Every single thing we see Haman do is either for his own ego or to pull someone else down. And it really does show us the effects of embracing sin in your life. This is what Haman did all the way through. It distorts your understanding, so much so that you can become entirely self-obsessed and with that paranoid and angry, because your happiness is linked to circumstances that you're trying to control but often can't. So you're always bouncing around and trying to control things. So you end up always worried, always critical of others, and trying to pull others down all the time. That's what sin does, and it destroys you. And Haman is a great exemplar of all that. Okay, so now Haman has got to go to the king himself, which of course is risky, as we know. Plus it's late at night, so I don't know if this was just Haman's arrogance or what, but he's obviously really wanting to get rid of this jerk Mordecai. But as it turns out, the king was not able to sleep that night, so he had some boring old palace history records read to him, because that should do the trick, right? Help you go to sleep. Except it just so happened that he was read to about the time that Mordecai saved his life. So that was the episode he happened to be reading that night. And he realised at that moment that Mordecai had not been rewarded for that. So as this was on his mind, this idea of Mordecai, he finds out right-hand man Haman is waiting outside to talk to him. So Haman gets invited in. So I guess Haman goes, phew, to that. And he got invitation in, so he didn't have to worry about trying to work out if he's going to get received or not. And I can't describe the story from here any better than the Bible does. It's a brilliant little episode. So let's read from 6 verse 6. This is fantastic. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honour?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honour more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honour, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse and the king that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honour, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour.'" Haman thinking that's going to be me. Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." I think that's classic. Don't ever tell me God's not in control. The timing of all that is brilliant. So it ends up that Haman has to organise and lead the procession to honour Mordecai, which I'm sure he would have done through very gritted teeth. And it's the first stage in showing that the wheel is starting to turn against Haman. And his wife knows it. Ladies are more sensitive to these things, I think. And when he gets home, she tells him that you can't fight against Jews and win. And so he's getting nervous now. But at least he can console himself with the fact that he's got another special dinner with the two most powerful people in the kingdom. Little does he know this will be his last meal. Because when he gets there, Esther finally gets to ask the king what she's really wanted to ask him all along. And we'll let the Bible again tell this bit of the story here. But do keep in mind that Xerxes still doesn't know that Esther is a Jew, right? And neither does he know that the people group he's actually approved the destruction of in recent days is the Jewish people. But Esther's going to bring those things together for him, and as Haman watches on. So Xerxes says, "What do you want?" And then we read in 7 verses 3 to 4. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favour in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been merely sold as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king." Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this?" So apparently at this point, King Xerxes is still not making the connection. So she spells it out for him, exposing Haman in the process. Verse 6, and Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Imagine fingers pointing. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. He was terrified because he saw the penny finally drop for King Xerxes, and he knew that he'd been busted, especially because the fact that the queen was a Jew was new information to him as well, to the king, and to Haman. So the king was understandably very angry, and so he has Haman executed. And not just any old how. He had him impaled on the stake that he had erected to kill Mordecai on. So it was his own property with his own weapon. Makes me think about the wise words concerning the wicked in Psalm 7, 15 to 16. You don't need to go there, I'll bring it up. He makes a pit, digging it out, and falls into the hole he has made. His mischief returns upon his own head, and on his own skull his violence descends. There's lots of psalms that say that kind of thing, so yeah. And God ensures this happens. It might be sooner, or it might be later, or it might even be at the judgment seat after they die. But God is just, and it will happen. So it happened sooner for Haman. So as a result, the estate of Haman was immediately handed over to Esther, that's in 8 verse 1, who then appointed Mordecai as manager of the estate. And yes, I'm including these details because they matter. Okay, so quickly, now let's finish off the story. Now the problem remains of the edict of death to the Jews, which can't be repealed under Persian law. So Esther appeals to the king again, and this time he does what he did for Haman before and hands her the ring of his power and lets her do as she wants with it. So she, along with Mordecai, send out a new edict that the Jews have the right to defend themselves from attackers on this coming doomsday, the 13th of Adar. And so once this news has gone out, as we read before in the comparison, many people are turning to Yahweh and his people. Now, some of them may not have been genuine believers. They might have just been joining what they could tell was soon to be the winning team. But the point is, many Gentiles were entering the fold in this period before the day of reckoning. So when that day came, the Jews actually had victory over everyone who wanted to murder them. And among the enemies destroyed that day were the 10 sons of Haman, presumably ending the line of Haman and the Amalekites, though I guess we can't be 100% sure of that. And the celebration of Purim, held to this day, is the celebration of that event. Okay, so that's the story of Esther, and I'm not sure how much you might have picked up as we went through about how it tells us about God's plan of redemption of all things, right through the millennium and beyond, actually. But to make sense of it, first I'm going to propose who or what each of the key players represent. And I hasten to clarify again, I'm in no way suggesting that these people are fictitious or that the happenings in Esther are just made up. What I'm saying is that God is powerful and smart enough to superintend events such that they play out according to his foreordained pattern, all the while never stepping on a person's free will. He just opens doors and you walk through them yourself. And if you wonder how he does that, well, you can join the queue behind me and others when we get to heaven and have the chance to ask him. So basically, here's what I've come to, my current thinking as a proposal for you to consider. There are the two main protagonists, okay, Esther, who represents Jesus, and Haman, who represents Satan, sin, death, and really the world, with all its evil and destiny for destruction. So in a sense, Satan is all those things personified. He brings them to a head. And regarding Esther, you might say, but Esther's a woman. How can she represent Jesus? Well, I don't find that a big deal myself. We're not saying Jesus is a woman. It's just that in this context, a woman gives the best representation of the roles of Messiah in the story. Okay? So then we have Mordecai. And I'm going to suggest he represents the greatest king of Israel so far, David. At times you could argue that he embodies the people who David the king is the figurehead for, so the nation of Israel. The ways and the law under which they are governed as well, all that's kind of in there. And I might talk that way at times. It's kind of all that stuff kind of brings into a head at David. So like how Satan is the figurehead for worldliness, David is the figurehead for Israel, I think, in this story. So really I would argue that David is the main character represented by Mordecai. And even Queen Vashti has a role. She can be likened to the Gentile kings of the world, I would argue. And one that might stir you up a little maybe, but King Xerxes, and many scholars agree with me, believe he represents God the Father. Actually, should the other way around. I agree with many scholars who say that. He represents God the Father in this story. Now remember, that's not to say that everything he does is right. So we have to know where the limits are when we apply typology. But overall, I hope you'll soon see why I say that, even if you don't agree. We're allowed to disagree, that's fine. So there are the main players, I propose. Now there are others too, but they don't really feature in the summary I'm going to give you now. And I'm going to do that by taking us through 12 quick ways that I have compiled that the story of Esther points us prophetically to the gospel. Now others may differ a little on these points, and I've read other people's versions of this, but that's okay. It's always a work in progress, but please do consider it. And I'm going to do this by talking about the type from the story of Esther first, and then explain what I think it represents, or who I think it represents in the greater story of salvation. And as we do, I'm going to parallel this with a diagram. I love diagrams. If those who've heard me speak know I use them a bit, but I think it's helpful because it helps bring it together based on a collision course between Esther and Haman, okay? If you're confused, that's fine. Will make sense in the end. Okay, number one. Esther begins under Mordecai and is obedient to him. And we saw that was her pattern all the time. Whatever Mordecai said, she did. So what was the greater thing this foreshadows? Well, Jesus was born under the law, the legal structure of the government that David personifies, and he also obeys it perfectly, keeping his full glory veiled for all but the transfiguration. Even though that wasn't his full glory, but you know, he kept it veiled the vast majority of the time. And even then it was only to his closest disciples, the transfiguration anyway. That he was perfectly obedient and sinless is clear from the New Testament verses such as Hebrews 4:15, which speaks of Jesus who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So we're told he's sinless. And on our diagram we'll naturally put that early on. Okay, so we're going to work our way in here. Number two, Vashti was deposed from her position as queen. She didn't cut the mustard as far as Xerxes was concerned, whether the reason was a short-term one, just because he was angry on that day, or a long-term one, so he kicked her, whatever it was, he kicked her out of the authority role that she had. And this is like what God did with the kingdoms of the world. He had to, in a sense, start again with the nation of Israel, because the powers he'd placed over the nations were turning away from him. And worse than that, they couldn't do anything to save his faithful ones. So Isaiah writes in 59 verse 16 that he saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought him salvation and his righteousness upheld him. So that verse goes a little further and points us to Jesus. But the point here is that there was no one who led his people well, neither politically or in salvation. So he deposed them. Or in some sense this is future, right? And he will depose them, like the rock hitting the feet of the statue in Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, that sort of illustrates that issue. And since that's dealing with the worldly side of things, we'll put that on the Haman side of the chart. And so we're stepping in from the outside here. Number 3. Esther was made queen when she pleased the king and was proven worthy in character. Does that remind you of anybody? Well, except I guess he was a king, not queen. But yes, Jesus pleased the ultimate authority and has been proclaimed king. When do we see Jesus affirmed by this authority? Well, at the transfiguration that we just mentioned is one, but also at his baptism, where God said in Matthew 3:17 here, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." Okay, so this is quite a step forward for Esther, going back to the type. And a step up too above Mordecai, which leads us into number 4. Mordecai recognises Esther's authority, so in 4 verse 17. Okay, so now we're a bit more familiar with the types. You should be trying to think when David recognises the authority of Jesus, which you might think is tricky because David lived 1,000 years before Jesus came. But there is a time he explicitly does that. In fact, Jesus himself quotes it. Any idea? Yeah, I'm thinking of the one Jesus actually used very cleverly, Psalm 110 verse 1, where David writes this: "The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool." That is, God the Father is speaking to God the Son, and David calls the Son my Lord. Okay? So that's good enough for me to say that David acknowledges Jesus, I would say. He just didn't know that was going to be his name at the time. Jesus just is talking about God the Son. So that's another point on the good side of our chart, where Mordecai recognises Esther's authority. Number 5. Now we're going to get to the heart of the story, okay? So number 5 will say Esther wrestles with her responsibility to save. So for many of us, this might bring to mind a certain location. And if it does, then it shows you're starting to understand the pattern now. What's the location? The Garden of Gethsemane, that's right. This is where Jesus wrestled in his spirit with the responsibility of saving mankind. And we know he asked for that cup to be taken from him, but I think the clearest description of how he really felt is found in a couple of verses after that. So Luke 22, verse 44. "And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground." So it's pretty clear he was fighting a battle that we may never fully comprehend. But it's important we know that this happened because God has included it in the typology here. So just there's that link. And if you are really perceptive, you can see in the diagram there that this is the moment of surrender, that you see things start to turn up for Esther. Okay, but we'll see more of that in a minute. But anyway, that's where we placed Esther's internal struggle, just here, okay? Number 6. Esther dies to herself on behalf of her people at Passover, that's 4 verse 16. And she rises to intercede for them at the Feast of First Fruits, 5 verse 1. Now first, I'd just like to say that even though she sacrificed for her own genetic people, remember that later on through it, Gentiles come in too. So this is really not limited to Jews. It's open to all who will come. In the end, Esther, putting her life on the line, opened the way for all. And of course, I say it like that to point us directly to the ultimate antitype, Jesus, Jesus who willingly gave his life for us, obviously. And as we noted before, I don't believe this is any coincidence at all. It was planned by God that this happened right at Passover time, because Passover was always designed by God to be a picture of the ultimate lamb that was slain. And it's not just Nisan 14th that is significant here. 3 days later is the Feast of First Fruits, when the first cut part of the crops from the coming harvest are presented, waved before God as a sign that more was coming. In the same way, Esther arose from her 3-day sacrifice and presented herself to the king. And again, in the same way, Jesus arose from the dead on the 3rd day and presented himself to the Father as the first fruits from among the dead, as Paul describes him in 1 Corinthians 15:20. And now he's doing what? Interceding, as interceding for us, as Hebrews 7:25 says. So this is equally amazing and fascinating that God orchestrated events to convey these truths. And it just shows how central the cross is to all of God's plans. And to demonstrate that, let's put the cross in the middle of all this. Plus there's more to this. And we're going to approach the cross from the other side now. Take a different angle, because that's how I see this story does it. This is the picture that came to my mind as I was working through this. Number 7. Haman is dealt with in his death on a tree, turning away the king's wrath. Obviously, this is the same thing Jesus did, right? Took the sins on the tree. But this time it's viewing his sacrifice from the other side, from the sin side. In him, sin and guilt are dealt with on a tree such that we are taken out of the way of God's wrath. Because he, Jesus, became sin for us, which is 2 Corinthians 5:21, for those taking notes. Or in the words of Galatians 3:13, he became a curse for us. Or again, as we saw early on, he fulfilled that type of the serpent on the pole in the wilderness. It's probably the best picture here. So sin on the pole, and Jesus became sin for us. So the serpent representing sin, it was put to death on a tree and raised up so we could all look to it and live. So now, since we're looking from the other side of things, we'll extend Haman's path to show that. And I just want us to have a look at that for a minute. How this whole story is focused on the nexus of the cross. The cross is not just the means of salvation, it's very much that, but it's also the dividing line of history and the dividing line of souls. How you respond to the cross will determine your eternal destiny too. So I hope you've had that time in your life already. And you can see here how Esther and Haman's destinies couldn't be more different. It's only going to get more so. So let's have a look. Number 8. Haman's property and authority comes under Esther's control, which she passes on to Mordecai, which we can read about in Esther 8, verses 1 to 2. In the same way, after the tribulation and Jesus' return and the millennial reign of Jesus is established, in that day a resurrected King David will again be king over Israel, taking back Satan's usurped control, which is extended to the whole world. And I know many of you are thinking, but hang on, isn't that Jesus' job? Yes, it is. Only, I would argue that the ultimate throne of David is the one that Jesus rules the whole creation from. That throne will be above any other, and he will rule from Jerusalem, as will David. But he will be king over just the nation of Israel under Jesus. That's my thesis. So yes, Israel and Jerusalem will be the centre of everything. Jesus at the top, with David ruling Israel. And yes, I know you say, but what about Ezekiel 34 and 37? Isn't that just saying David as in the son of David? When that's what we're taught. And to that I say, if God wanted to talk about the son of David, he would have said the son of David, I believe. But he didn't. And 4 times, twice in chapter 34 and twice in chapter 37, God says David will be the king or prince in Israel. And I think we generally agree amongst us here that if the plain meaning makes sense, seek no other sense, right? You heard that before? It works, so I see no reason to take it any other way. So here's one of those verses, Ezekiel 37:25, speaking of Israel. They and their children and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David my servant shall be their prince forever. So you can see in our diagram that Haman's influence is waning very fast at the end of it all, so he's heading south, right? Okay, number 9. During this period, so before the 13th of Adar, Gentiles voluntarily become Jews. So that's 8:17. So the timing here is instructive, I believe. So it's after the death of Haman, but before the day intended to be destruction for the Jews. In the pattern, this corresponds, I would say, to our current church age, when it's predominantly an era of Gentiles coming to Christ rather than Jews. And Romans 11:13 to 18 talks all about that, how Gentiles are grafted into the vine, which is Jesus. So now we switch back to Esther's line on the chart and show where the church age fits in. as represented by the Gentiles becoming Jews in the story. And I do, again, like to clarify, I don't like leaving people wondering that Gentiles don't become Jews in our church era today. Anyone who trusts in Christ is a Christian, Jew or Gentile. So let's keep that clear and also stay away from replacement theology, okay? The church in Israel are dealt with separately. Number 10. When the 13th of Adar comes, which was planned by Haman to be the day of death of the Jews, it instead becomes a day of deliverance and a great victory of God over the rebellious. So that typifies the truth that the coming tribulation, the beginning of the day of the Lord, is intended by Satan to be the time of extermination for the Jews. Now, certainly there will be many killed, but ultimately Jesus delivers them instead. And we see him riding on the white horse there in Revelation 19, 11 to 16. And they are purified and glorified such that, remember Romans 11:26, all Israel will be saved. That is, the only Jews left at the start of the millennium will be believing Jews. So, Satan's plan has been turned on its head again. And that is the next part in our chart, as Esther's path continues to climb. So 13th of Adar was intended to be destruction, became deliverance. Okay, nearly there. Number 11. Haman's sons are killed on the tree as well, just like their father was at the word of Esther. So we could say, to reflect this, that all sin was dealt with at Calvary. But it's probably just as fitting to see this as a combination of both Jesus' first and second comings. He dealt with the sin problem on the cross and comes back later to mop up the rest of the mess in the authority of that victory. And how does he get rid of the rebels when he returns? By a sword that comes out of his mouth, right? Revelation 19:15. So it's his word that determines every person's fate, just like Esther here. In fact, you can see Esther is really driving all the cleanup that happens here in chapter 9. And especially in verses 13 and 29 and 32 for, again, those taking notes. That's 13, 29 and 32. So because this is all about dealing with the mess of sin, this goes on the last entry on the Haman line. And with that, his bloodline probably ends, just like how in the end Jesus deals with sin. But that doesn't fully happen until the eternal state after millennium. The millennium is much, much, much better, but there's still some sin and death. So you can see this is a far-reaching prophetic pattern, right? It goes all the way. All right, to the last one now. Number 12, the final authority structure in the kingdom is Xerxes, then Esther, and then Mordecai. And yes, 10 verse 3 does say that Mordecai ends up second in command to Xerxes, but I think this simply skips the simple fact that the queen and the king are together at the top. In a male-dominated era, that's typical for women to be omitted. But as we saw, she's the one doing all the commanding in the end. Now let me put it another way as we explain what this type points to. Saying Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, in verse 3, is the equivalent of saying David the king of Israel is second only to God, since we treat Jesus and the Father as one. Maybe treat that as the pattern to work with. Okay. So the final structure in Israel for eternity will be God, Jesus, David. All right, so you've made it. Here it is. And that's our diagram. Now finished with God's planned authority in place. And this is how it will be forever, as we read in Ezekiel 37:25 and those other verses around that area. Okay, so there you go. Can you see how God's way is always sacrifice and selflessness? Sacrifice and selflessness. That's the Lord's way. And I've taken up enough of your time, but it was great to be able to show you some of the incredible design behind the events in Esther. I hope that was helpful. I guess all that's left to say is what an amazing God we serve. Amen. Let's pray. Thank you, Lord, for your word to us, and thank you just for the incredible book of Esther. May, when we read it in future, it just give us a greater awareness of who you are and what you've done for us, what you are doing and what you will do. So we thank you, Lord, for your truth and for your Son, Jesus, who makes it all work. So we pray this in Jesus' mighty name. Amen.